John Griffin's family history was marked by both loyalty and struggle. Growing up, his father, a war veteran, instilled in his children the values of resilience and unity. Their mother's unexpected end of life when John was only 10 created a void that altered the dynamics within the family. While Carl sought solace in the streets, John focused on academics, becoming the steadying force in their household. This dichotomy defined their relationship. Carl's boldness and John's stability often clashed, but also complemented each other. In high school, John fell in love for the first time with a girl named Elena. She was vibrant, intelligent, and shared his passion for literature. Their bond was profound but short-lived. Elena's family relocated to Europe, leaving John heartbroken. This early experience with loss shaped his cautious approach to relationships, making him deeply value commitment and trust when he eventually met Linda years later. Before John married Linda, he briefly mentored troubled youth as part of a community outreach program. One boy, Marcus, stood out for his brilliance, but also his tendency to attract trouble. John's support helped Marcus secure a scholarship, and while they lost touch over time, John often thought of those days as some of the most rewarding in his life. Marcus would later reappear unexpectedly with news that would complicate John's world. During Linda's early career, she and John faced a financial crisis. A bad investment wiped out their savings, forcing John to work multiple jobs while Linda pursued her MBA. This period of hardship strengthened their bond and highlighted their resilience as a couple. John often reminisced about those lean years, viewing them as proof of their enduring partnership, unaware of the cracks forming beneath the surface. One summer, John and Carl embarked on a road trip to reconnect. They visited their childhood home, shared stories of their late mother, and camped under the stars. On this trip, Carl confided details about his past that John had never known, including a near-end encounter during his gang years. This moment solidified their relationship, with John urging Carl to turn his life around, an appeal that eventually led Carl to leave his criminal activities behind. At a neighborhood barbecue 3 years before Linda's business trips became frequent, John met a man named Richard who worked in corporate security. They struck up a friendship, and Richard's stories of uncovering corporate fraud intrigued John. Though he didn't know it then, this connection would later prove invaluable when John's suspicions about Linda began to grow, setting the stage for truths he never imagined confronting. John Griffin sat in his dimly lit living room, the faint light of the television flickering against the walls. Though the show played on, his thoughts wandered elsewhere. Earlier that day, his wife Linda had flown to Florida for a business trip. John had always trusted her. Jealousy had never been part of his nature, but tonight an unshakable unease lingered in his chest, gnawing at his sense of calm. The sudden chime of his phone broke his train of thought. Glancing at the screen, he saw the caller ID, Carl, his older brother. "Hey, Carl," John said, trying to sound casual. "What's going on?" Carl Griffin wasn't just his brother. He was a man with a reputation. Once a feared gangster with a violent past, Carl had ruled the streets with ruthless efficiency. His enemies vanished, his rivals crumbled, and his name carried an air of dread. But to John, Carl was family. A fiercely loyal protector who had left that dark world behind at John's urging, seeking a quieter, more respectable life. "Not much," Carl replied, his tone calm but serious. "But we need to talk." John frowned, sensing the weight behind Carl's words. "What about—" "I've been keeping tabs on Linda," Carl said, his voice steady but laced with something unspoken. "She's in Florida, yeah, but I saw something that doesn't sit right." A chill ran through John. "What are you trying to say?" Carl's response was blunt. "She's with another man. This trip? It's not just business." John's breath caught. "Are you sure? That's a big accusation, Carl." "I'm sure," Carl said firmly. "I saw her, kissing him, and I've got the evidence to back it up." John felt his stomach twist as his phone buzzed with an incoming message. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing photos and videos. In one image, Linda was locked in an intimate kiss with a man John didn't recognize. Another showed them laughing and holding hands in a hotel lobby. A video captured them in a car, her hand tangled in his hair, his arm draped possessively around her waist. This can't be real," John murmured, his voice breaking. "It's real," Carl said, his tone as cold as steel. "You needed to know. I wasn't about to let you stay in the dark." John's grip on the phone tightened, anger rising to the surface. "If you knew, why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I wanted to be certain," Carl replied evenly. You don't go throwing around accusations like this without proof. Now you have it. John's mind reeled, his thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief, betrayal, and rage. What am I supposed to do with this, Carl? You need to think smart, Carl said. Get a private investigator. Gather solid evidence. If this leads to divorce, you'll need leverage. Without it, you're walking into a storm, unarmed. I don't want to go there, John said, his voice strained. That's not me. I just want the truth. And how do you plan to get it? Carl challenged. If you confront her without proof, she'll deny everything, or worse, turn it around on you. You can't afford to play this wrong. John exhaled deeply, his mind racing. Carl's advice made sense, but the thought of hiring a private investigator felt alien, invasive. I don't know, Carl. This feels messy. It is messy, Carl said sharply, but sitting back won't make it go away. Protect yourself, John. Get the evidence, then decide what to do. John rubbed his temple, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. And if I don't? What if I just let it slide? Then you'll live with the lie, Carl said bluntly, and she'll keep walking all over you. Look, I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but ignoring it won't make it better. Do it smart, or don't do it at all. For a moment, John was silent, staring at the damning photos on his phone. Fine, he said finally, his voice tight. I'll hire the PI, but Carl, if I ever get my hands on this guy... Stop, Carl interrupted sharply. Don't go down that road. I've seen where revenge leads, and trust me, it's not worth it. Let the investigator handle it. Keep your head on straight. John closed his eyes, forcing himself to calm down. All right, he muttered. I'll handle this your way. But if there's more... Don't let your anger take over, Carl warned. I'm here, John. We'll figure it out. Just be smart about it. After hanging up, John sat in silence, Carl's words echoing in his head. The betrayal cut deep, and the idea of investigating his wife felt like a betrayal of his own. Yet the evidence Carl had provided was undeniable. His phone buzzed again, notifications piling up, texts from friends and one from Linda. Steeling himself, he opened her message. Miss you so much. Can't wait to be back home. Moments later, his phone rang. It was Linda. John hesitated before answering, forcing himself to sound normal. Hey, babe. Hey, you, Linda replied cheerfully, her voice warm and familiar. How's everything? I miss you. John clenched his jaw, the images flashing in his mind. I miss you too, he said carefully. How's Florida? Busy, but good, she said lightly. Just 2 more days and I'll be home. 2 more days, John echoed, keeping his tone even. You okay? Linda asked, her voice softening. You sound off. I'm fine, John lied. Just tired. Well, I'll make it up to you when I'm back, she said playfully. I promise. Looking forward to it, John replied, his voice strained. John set the phone down, his hands trembling. The silence in the room was deafening as he stared at it, unable to reconcile Linda's warm, affectionate voice with the betrayal he knew existed. The images and videos Carl had sent were burned into his mind, each one a cruel reminder that their life together was no longer what he thought. Yet, Linda's cheerful words, her loving tone, felt like she was still playing a part in the relationship they had built over the years. But now, the illusion was gone. She had crossed a line and John couldn't ignore it anymore. All he could do was wait, for answers, for clarity. 2 more days. It felt like forever. The next morning, determined to find the truth, John took Carl's advice. He couldn't sit in the uncertainty any longer. After some quick research, he found a private investigator named Frank, who came highly recommended. By that afternoon, John was sitting in Frank's modest office, the smell of coffee and leather filling the air. Frank, a sharp-eyed, no-nonsense man, greeted him with a firm handshake and motioned for him to sit. All right, Mr. Griffin, I've gone through your notes, but I need to hear it from you. What's going on? John took a deep breath, struggling to put his pain into words. My wife, Linda, has been traveling a lot for work. A few days ago, my brother told me he saw her with another man, kissing him. He sent me pictures and videos. I need to know if it's true, if there's more to it. I just can't live like this, not knowing. Frank nodded, jotting notes on a pad. Got it. We'll run surveillance and get you what you need. I've handled cases like this before. You'll get your answers. How long will it take? John asked, his voice tight with apprehension. Could be a few days, maybe a week. It depends on her schedule, but I'll get you something concrete, Frank assured him. John handed over the retainer, his hands shaking. I just need the truth. I can't make a mistake here. Frank met his gaze. "You're doing the right thing. Leave the rest to me." The next day, Linda returned home from Florida, all smiles and excitement. She greeted John with a warm hug and a kiss, acting as if nothing had changed. "I missed you so much," she said, her eyes bright. John forced a smile, keeping his tone even. "I missed you too. How was the trip?" "It was fine," she replied cheerfully, "but I'm glad to be home." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a playful tone. "I couldn't stop thinking about you. I need you." John's stomach churned, but he kept his composure. "Actually, I hurt my back while you were gone," he lied. "I think I need to rest tonight." Linda pouted, but nodded. "Okay, but don't keep me waiting too long," she teased before heading to their bedroom. John stood frozen, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. How could she act so normal after everything he'd seen? That night, while Linda slept soundly beside him, John lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He felt trapped between the life they had shared and the truth he couldn't ignore. A week later, John's phone buzzed. It was Frank. His heart raced as he answered. "What do you have for me?" he asked, his voice tense. "We need to talk in person," Frank said. "I have the report ready. It's important." "Is it bad?" John pressed, dread pooling in his chest. Frank hesitated. "Come to the office. I'll explain everything." John closed his eyes, bracing himself. The waiting was over, but the answers might be more than he could handle. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said before hanging up. He stared at the phone in his hand, his pulse pounding. The truth was within reach, and there was no turning back now. John entered Frank's office, his nerves frayed and his heart heavy. The weight of what he was about to learn pressed on him like a boulder. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew it wouldn't be good. Frank stood behind his cluttered desk, holding a glass of whiskey. "You look like you need something stronger than coffee," he said, sliding a shot of Jack Daniels across the desk. John picked up the glass and downed it in one gulp, the burn grounding him for a moment. "Thanks," he said, his voice strained. "Just lay it out for me. What did you find?" Frank pushed a thick folder toward him. "This is everything. I won't sugarcoat it. You're not going to like it." With trembling hands, John opened the folder. Inside were pictures, clear enough to remove any doubt. Linda was with two different men, Timothy Brown, her boss, and Alex Williams, the CEO. The photos weren't innocent. They showed closeness that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. Frank broke the silence. "She's not just cheating, John. She's involved with both of them, and not just separately, sometimes together. It's been going on for at least 2 years. John's breath hitched as he flipped through the damning evidence, photos, emails, and explicit messages. The betrayal cut deeper than he could have imagined. 2 years? He whispered. How could she hide this for so long? Frank nodded grimly. She's been careful, but not careful enough. I found texts, emails, even videos. This isn't just an affair, it's a lifestyle. John's hands shook as he skimmed through the explicit texts and watched a short video clip, his stomach churning. The Linda he saw in these exchanges was a stranger, callous, unfaithful, and cruel. In one particularly painful message, Linda dismissed John entirely. John's good with the kids and pays the bills, she wrote. Why not keep him around? He's just a means to an end. John felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She called me a loser, he muttered, the words barely audible. His wife, the woman he trusted with his heart, had reduced him to a convenient tool. Frank leaned forward, his expression serious. I know this is a lot to process, but you've got what you need. You can confront her or take legal action. Whatever you do, think it through. Don't act on anger alone. John nodded numbly, his mind reeling. I don't even know where to start, he admitted. What do I say? How do I face her? That's up to you, Frank replied. But now you have control. You know the truth, and you can decide what comes next. John rose from the chair, the folder clutched in his hand like a lifeline. Thanks, Frank, he said, though his voice was hollow. The truth was supposed to set him free, but all it had done was trap him in a new kind of torment. That night, John sat alone at his desk, his laptop open. He scrolled through the evidence again, each word and image cutting deeper than the last. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was emotional, financial, and personal. His wife had not only lied to him, but had belittled him, mocked him, and dismissed him as insignificant. John's thoughts swirled in a storm of anger, heartbreak, and confusion. The life he thought he knew had been an illusion, and the woman he loved had turned it into a farce. Now, all that remained was deciding what to do with the shards of the truth. The next video hit John like a gut punch. This time, Linda was talking to Alex Williams. "This marriage is just a facade," she said casually, her tone void of remorse. "John's a good provider, but he's never been what I wanted. He's so dull in bed. I want someone who's aggressive, someone who takes charge. I'm just using him. Nice house, kids, stability. As long as I keep the act up, I can still have my fun with you guys. What does it matter?" John's chest tightened. He had always believed their life together was built on love and partnership. They had raised 2 boys, shared milestones and weathered challenges side by side, or so he thought. But this wasn't just infidelity. It was outright mockery, Linda admitting she used him for appearances and financial security while living a double life. Then, the worst blow came. As he scrolled through more messages, he stumbled upon a chilling text Linda had sent to Timothy. "If John ever finds out, I'll ruin him," she wrote. "I'll tell the kids he's abusive. He won't stand a chance if I accuse him of hitting me. I'll take the house, the savings, everything. He's a sucker, and I'm the one in control." John froze, his blood running cold. The words echoed in his head like a nightmare. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a calculated plan to destroy him. She had no fear of him discovering the truth because she believed she could dismantle his life completely and emerge unscathed. The arrogance, the cold manipulation was staggering. He slammed the laptop shut, his hands trembling. His mind raced, trying to process the depth of Linda's deception. She had built their life together on lies, using him as a pawn in her selfish game. The worst part? She knew he was trapped. She banked on his love for their boys, on his fear of losing them, to keep him in check. Pacing the room, John ran his hands through his hair, anger and heartbreak swirling together. He felt like a prisoner in his own life, manipulated by the one person he had trusted the most. How had he been so blind? How could he have missed all the signs? His love for Linda had kept him from seeing the truth. And now, the reality of who she was crushed him. But one thing was clear. He couldn't stay in this marriage. Not after this. If Linda was willing to destroy him and weaponize their family for her own selfish gain, he had to fight back. Not just for himself, but for his boys. He wouldn't let her win. Grabbing his phone, he dialed Carl, his fingers trembling. His brother answered almost immediately. "Carl, it's John," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "I've seen everything. I can't stay in this marriage. She's been lying to me, using me, and now she's threatening to take everything. I don't know how I'm going to fight her, but I have to try." Carl's voice was steady, a lifeline in the chaos. "We'll figure this out, John. Don't rush into anything. You've got the evidence now. We'll take it step by step, and make sure you protect yourself and your boys. I'm with you, whatever you need." John exhaled shakily, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The road ahead would be brutal, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't powerless anymore. That evening, John sat at the dinner table, his mind churning as Linda walked in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She breezed into the room, smiling brightly and chatting about her day as if everything was perfectly normal. Sliding into her seat, she launched into a story about a successful meeting, excitedly sharing how she'd closed a major deal for the company. She radiated confidence, completely oblivious to the storm brewing within John. John set his fork down, his gaze fixed on her. This is it, he thought, the moment of reckoning. But not yet. Let her feel the pressure first. "So," he said casually, masking his simmering anger, "how was your day?" Linda grinned, not catching the tension in his tone. "It was amazing. We nailed a huge deal today. I'm on cloud 9. What about you? Anything exciting happen?" John leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Nothing much. Same old." He let the silence stretch for a moment before adding, "I was just wondering, though, what would you do if you found out I was seeing 2 women? Linda laughed, her response almost flippant. "Oh, I'd cut you off in every way. You'd be sleeping in the guest room nursing some serious regrets, that's for sure." John let out a slow breath, a sly smile creeping across his face. "Interesting," he said smoothly. "Because if I found out you were seeing 2 men, I guess I'd be justified in doing the same." Her laughter faltered, the smile slipping from her face. She set her fork down carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice uncertain. John kept his tone steady, his gaze unflinching. "Oh, nothing. Just curious if you'd apply the same standards to yourself. You know, hypothetically." Her confidence wavered, her smile now forced. "You're being ridiculous, John. I don't know where this is coming from, but it's not funny." John leaned forward, his voice calm but cutting. "You're right. It's not funny. But I think you'll find it less amusing when I have everything I need to prove what you've been up to." Linda's face paled, her eyes darting away for a split second before she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, trying to regain her composure. "You're acting crazy." John shook his head, his tone light but laced with menace. "Don't worry, Linda. I'm sure you'll have a perfectly good explanation. I'll give you plenty of time to come up with it." She sat frozen, her mask of confidence completely shattered. The cracks in her demeanor were obvious now, her fear palpable. John rose from his seat slowly, the chair scraping against the floor as he stood. He paused, letting the silence stretch unbearably, then turned and walked out of the room. He didn't need to say anything more. Her reaction had told him everything he needed to know. The next day, John met Carl at a quiet coffee shop. They exchanged few words, their mutual understanding filling the silence. The events of the previous evening played over and over in John's mind, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of direction. "I'm done," John said finally, breaking the silence. "I can't live like this anymore. She's crossed every line. It's time to take control." Carl nodded, his voice firm. "You're doing the right thing. She's been getting away with this for too long. You've got my support, and we'll make sure she doesn't walk all over you." John took a deep breath, grateful for Carl's unwavering presence. He wasn't alone in this fight. With his brother by his side, he finally felt ready to confront the lies, protect his future, and rebuild the pieces of his life that Linda had so carelessly shattered. Together, they would make sure she faced the consequences of her actions. Later that day, John and Carl met with a highly recommended divorce lawyer, renowned for his relentless courtroom tactics. The lawyer's sleek, modern office exuded professionalism and authority, designed to intimidate and impress. It was clear this was the kind of place people came when they needed results, no matter the cost. Walking in, John felt a pang of unease. This was a step he never thought he'd take, but it was now his only choice. The lawyer, a sharp-dressed man in his 40s, stood to greet them with a practiced smile and a firm handshake. Mr. Griffin," the lawyer said, his tone polished and professional. "Let's get started. I understand we have a complicated case on our hands." John matched his handshake, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Yes, I'm ready to move forward." They sat down, and the lawyer wasted no time. "Here's the plan. We'll file for divorce immediately, but I understand you also want to pursue an alienation of affection lawsuit against her boss and the CEO, correct?" John nodded firmly. "Yes, they enabled the affair. They knew what was going on and didn't stop it. I want them held accountable." The lawyer raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "That's a bold move, but it could work. To succeed, we'll need airtight evidence. I'll handle the legal strategy, but you'll need to organize your financial situation. We need a clear picture of your assets, liabilities, and income before we proceed." John hesitated for a moment, realizing how much he had trusted Linda to handle their finances. "I'll pull everything together," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Bank statements, investments, retirement accounts, whatever you need." The lawyer nodded, jotting down notes. "Good. The faster you get me those details, the sooner we can move forward. In the meantime, we'll prepare the divorce paperwork and the lawsuit." John leaned back in his chair, feeling overwhelmed but resolute. The betrayal had been devastating, but he was determined to fight for his future. "Let's move quickly," he said firmly. "I'm done waiting." The lawyer gave him a reassuring nod. "I'll have the paperwork ready in 3 days. Focus on your finances and any additional evidence we can use. We'll take it from there." As John and Carl left the office, Carl gave his brother a supportive pat on the back. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "We'll get through this, no matter what." 3 days later, John returned to the lawyer's office, this time with Carl by his side. Tension and anticipation hung in the air as they prepared for the next steps. John had made a bold decision. He transferred all his assets to Carl for a nominal amount and loaned him his savings under the guise of a business venture. It was a risky but strategic move to shield his finances from Linda's grasp. The lawyer greeted them with a curious look as they sat down. Carl wasted no time explaining. "John has loaned me his savings and transferred all assets to my name for a business venture. The house, investments, everything. It's no longer tied to him." The lawyer smirked slightly, leaning back in his chair. Unconventional, but effective. If the judge isn't biased, this could work. It's risky, but I've seen worse. John's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. I don't care if it's risky. I'm making sure Linda can't take anything. She won't touch the house, the savings, or my future. This is about protecting what's mine. The lawyer nodded, his demeanor turning serious. Understood. I'll get the divorce paperwork ready and include a restraining order. You're within your rights to ensure she stays away from the kids and your property. John's voice was steady, his resolve unshakable. Yes, I want her out of my life and away from my kids. She's done enough damage, and I won't let her manipulate them. Carl chimed in, his tone firm. He's right. We need to protect the boys. She's not fit to be around them after everything. The lawyer jotted down more notes. We'll file for the restraining order alongside the divorce, but be prepared. This won't be easy. She's going to fight back. John clenched his fists at the thought of Linda's inevitable retaliation. He knew she wouldn't let him go without a fight, but it no longer mattered. He was done playing her games. His focus was now on his children, keeping them safe and ensuring their future. I'm ready for whatever's next, John said, locking eyes with the lawyer. Make sure the papers are ready. I want her served immediately. The lawyer nodded, already scribbling notes. We'll file the restraining order and divorce papers together. She'll be served within the next few days. John stood, a grim determination settling over him. This was the first step toward freedom. It wouldn't be easy, but he was prepared to fight. Carl gave him an encouraging nod, and John turned to the lawyer. Just get it done, John said firmly. No delays. The lawyer's approving glance spoke volumes. We're on it, John. Trust me. We're in this to win. At that same moment, Linda was in the CEO's office, tangled in yet another clandestine affair. She had played this dangerous game for over 2 years, always confident she could keep it hidden. But today felt different. The door was locked, the blinds drawn, but their moment of closeness was interrupted by a sharp knock. Both froze, panic flashing across their faces as they scrambled to adjust their clothes. The CEO fastened his belt while Linda smoothed her blouse, her pulse racing. "Who is it?" the CEO barked, irritation lacing his voice. The knock came again, more insistent. The door creaked open and a man in a sharp suit stepped inside, holding 3 sealed manila envelopes. He spoke with calm authority. "You've been served. Divorce petition for Miss Linda Griffin, a restraining order, and a $20 million alienation of affection lawsuit against the company." Linda's face drained of color as she took the envelope, her hands trembling. The CEO, visibly rattled, accepted his as well. "John did this?" he asked, his voice strained. "What the hell is going on?" Linda tore open her envelope, her stomach twisting as she scanned the documents. It was official. John wasn't just walking away, he was fighting back. The restraining order barred her from their children, and the lawsuit struck at the heart of her career. Her carefully crafted facade was crumbling. "How did he find out?" she whispered, anger bubbling beneath her fear. She had underestimated John, always thinking of him as predictable and weak, but now he had turned the tables. "This is a disaster," the CEO muttered, pacing the room. "We need to handle this carefully. The company's reputation is at stake." Linda barely heard him. Her thoughts raced as the enormity of the situation sank in. John hadn't just exposed her. He had launched an attack that threatened her career, reputation, and financial stability. Before they could regroup, the head of HR walked into the office, his expression cold. "Alex, Linda," he said, his tone firm, "you're both required to vacate immediately. Your access to company assets and premises has been revoked." The CEO's face paled. "What? This has to be a mistake." "No mistake," HR replied curtly. "The board, shareholders, and head office have reviewed the evidence. Texts, emails, videos. Terminations are effective immediately. Legal will handle your severance and benefits." Linda's heart pounded as she looked between the HR head and Alex. Everything was unraveling too quickly. Her affair, her manipulations, her career. What she'd worked so hard to hide was now exposed. Alex, pale and stunned, turned to the HR head. "You can't just do this. I've given years to this company. What about everything I've built here?" The HR head's expression remained cold. "The company doesn't tolerate this kind of behavior. You've compromised not just your position, but the organization's integrity. Shareholders will decide the next steps, but for now, you're both out. Clear your desks and leave." He shifted his gaze to Linda. "Your access to the building and company systems is revoked. Make arrangements to gather your belongings by the end of the day." Alex clenched his fists but knew he had no choice. He turned to Linda. We'll figure this out. We need to make some calls. This can't be the end. But Linda wasn't listening. Her thoughts were fixated on the evidence, emails, texts, and videos that had been sent to the board, the shareholders, and everyone else who mattered. The truth was out, and there was no undoing it. As they began packing their belongings, Alex's phone buzzed relentlessly. Glancing at the screen, his face went pale. "It's my wife," he muttered. She knows. She knows everything." His hands shook as he typed a hasty reply, desperate to salvage something. Linda glanced at her own phone, which was flooded with notifications. Texts, emails, missed calls. Each one felt like another piece of her life crumbling away. By the time Linda reached her car, her phone rang again. It was Timothy Brown, her boss, his voice frantic. "Linda, I've been served. Divorce papers, restraining orders. What's happening? My wife has everything. Texts, videos, the works. We're both screwed." Linda gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "It's over, Timothy," she said flatly. "John has it all. He's filing lawsuits, and the company's done with us. There's no way out." Timothy swore loudly. "My wife's already served me. Same as you. I'm finished." The weight of the situation hit Linda like a physical blow. It wasn't just her marriage crumbling. It was her entire life. Her career, reputation, and everything she had built were gone. She wasn't alone in her downfall. Alex and Timothy were suffering the same fate. By the end of the day, both men had received divorce papers and restraining orders from their wives, sealing their disgrace. Sitting in her car, Linda clutched her phone, staring blankly ahead. Everything was over. The lies, the betrayal, they had all come back to destroy her. Across town, John sat with Carl, watching the aftermath unfold. "It's done," John said quietly, his voice firm. "Linda was served, the company's reeling, and I've finally taken back control of my life." Carl nodded. "You did the right thing. Don't let her mess with your head anymore." While John felt a semblance of peace returning, Linda simmered with anger. Days of humiliation and bitterness consumed her. John had exposed her, taken everything from her, and left her life in shambles. Now, all she wanted was revenge. In Alex's dimly lit apartment, Linda, Alex, and Timothy huddled around a table, their voices low and urgent. The rage in Linda's eyes was unmistakable. She was no longer the woman trying to keep up appearances. She was someone consumed by vengeance. "He has to pay," Linda hissed, her fists tightening. "I want him to suffer the way I have. I want him gone." Alex, trying to remain composed, exchanged a glance with Timothy. "We'll need a solid plan. No mistakes. It has to look like an accident." Timothy, known for his recklessness, smirked darkly. "Don't worry, he'll never see it coming." As John sat at home, the silence around him only amplified the emotional wreckage of the past few days. The house was eerily quiet, with only the occasional creak of the floorboards or the hum of the refrigerator breaking the stillness. Carl stayed close, vigilant and ready for anything. Knowing Linda's escalating fury made the situation volatile. Despite his physical and emotional exhaustion, John drew comfort from Carl's steady presence. Around midnight, a sharp, loud knock shattered the quiet. "Who the hell is that?" John muttered, startled. Carl was already on his feet, instinctively reaching for the weapon he kept nearby. Before he could get to the door, it burst open, and Linda stormed in, followed by Alex and Timothy. The tension in the room exploded as Linda pulled a tool from her bag, her shaking hands aiming the barrel directly at John. "Did you really think you could ruin my life and walk away unscathed?" Linda hissed, her voice venomous. Her wild eyes betrayed the unstable fury driving her actions. Before John could respond, 2 firearm discharges rang out. He doubled over, collapsing to the floor, clutching his stomach as his breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. The metallic tang of blood filled the air as Carl moved swiftly, grabbing his tool from the drawer and firing back with precision. "Get out of here!" Carl shouted, his voice commanding as bullets splintered the walls around them. Linda screamed, ducking behind Alex and Timothy as the chaotic exchange unfolded. Carl's quick response caught them off guard. Panic overtook their bravado, and they scrambled for the door. Their retreat was frantic, their plan unraveling in the face of Carl's fierce defense. Linda was the first to flee, with Alex and Timothy close behind. The sound of their footsteps faded into the night as Carl turned his attention to John. "John!" Carl dropped to his knees, placing his hands over John's stomach in an attempt to stop the bleeding. His voice was steady but urgent as he pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. "My brother's been shot. 2 firearm discharge wounds to the stomach," Carl said urgently. "We need an ambulance now." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as help neared. Carl stayed by John's side, applying pressure to the wounds, his voice low and steady as he tried to keep John conscious. "Stay with me, John. You're going to be okay." Hours later, John lay unconscious in a hospital bed, stabilized but weakened from the ordeal. Carl paced the waiting room, the gravity of the night pressing heavily on him. Police had already begun piecing together the events. Evidence left behind, coupled with neighborhood surveillance footage, gave them a clear trail. Linda, Alex, and Timothy were now fugitives. As the authorities issued an APB for the trio, Carl couldn't shake the image of his brother gravely injured, lying helpless on the floor. His anger simmered, and the desire for retribution grew stronger with every passing moment. Carl sat alone in his car, gripping the steering wheel as his thoughts churned. Linda and her lovers had tried to take everything from John: his life, his dignity, his family. They had crossed a line, and Carl couldn't let it go unanswered. Reaching for his phone, Carl dialed a number he hadn't used in years. A gravelly voice answered almost immediately. "Carl, it's been a while. What's going on?" "I need the crew," Carl said, his tone cold and resolute. "John was attacked. Linda and her lovers did it. We're going after them." There was a brief pause before the voice replied, "Say no more. Where do you need us?" Carl quickly laid out the plan. A few of his trusted crew members would stay behind to guard John at the hospital, ensuring no further threats reached him while he recovered. The others would join Carl in tracking down Linda, Alex, and Timothy. These men were no strangers to taking care of unfinished business, and Carl didn't need to elaborate. They knew exactly what was at stake. Carl immediately called the private investigator, who had managed to uncover Linda's location after the shooting. "She's staying at 4516 Edgewood Avenue," the PI said. "She's there with the other two. Be careful." "Thanks," Carl replied, his voice cold and resolute. Gathering his crew, Carl drove toward the address. The tension in the car was thick, every man focused and ready. There was no room for hesitation. Linda and her accomplices needed to face the consequences of their actions, and Carl was determined to ensure they couldn't run. When they arrived, they surrounded the house swiftly and silently. Through the lit windows, shadows moved inside. Carl gave a signal, and his men burst through the door, splintering it with a crash. The house erupted in chaos as Carl's crew flooded in, tools drawn. Inside, Linda, Alex, and Timothy froze in shock, their expressions shifting from confusion to fear. "What is this?" Alex stammered, but Carl silenced him with a glare, stepping forward. "You've caused enough damage," Carl said coldly. "Now you're going to pay." Linda's bravado evaporated as fear took over. "Wait, Carl," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "This isn't what it looks like. They forced me into this." "Shut up!" Carl snapped, motioning for his men to restrain them. Linda, Alex, and Timothy were bound tightly and shoved against the wall. Carl loomed over them, his voice low and menacing. "You thought you could ruin John's life and walk away? You were wrong." Linda squirmed, her wide eyes filled with panic. "You can't do this," she cried. Carl leaned closer, his tone ice cold. "You're out of options. No one's coming to save you." The room fell silent except for their shallow breaths. Carl's men secured the house, ensuring there was no chance of escape. This wasn't about ending them. Not yet. It was about making them understand the consequences of their betrayal. "You're going to wish you never crossed my family," Carl said, his words cutting through the still air. "This is only the beginning." The crew moved quickly, transporting the restrained Linda, Alex, and Timothy in a convoy of 3 SUVs. The captives sat in the lead vehicle, bound and gagged, their muffled protests ignored. The atmosphere inside the cars was tense, charged with purpose. Carl sat in the second vehicle, his face set with a grim determination. His brother's life was hanging by a thread, and Carl wasn't about to let those responsible get away unscathed. One of the drivers broke the silence. "Are you sure about this, boss? This is serious." Carl didn't hesitate. "They tried to liquidate my brother. They crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. They'll pay for what they've done." The driver nodded, saying nothing more as they approached a remote location Carl had chosen carefully. Isolated and barren, it was the perfect spot for what he had in mind. The convoy crossed the border without issue, their movements efficient and practiced. Carl's crew had seen dangerous situations before, but this was different. This was personal. Under the moonlit sky, the SUVs rolled to a stop in a dusty clearing. The men exited the vehicles and dragged the captives out, their struggles futile. Thrown to the ground, Linda, Alex, and Timothy knelt in the dirt, their wide, fearful eyes darting between Carl and his crew. Carl stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry earth. His gaze was icy, his voice calm but laced with fury. "You thought you could destroy my family and just walk away?" He shook his head slowly, his expression hard. "You've made a terrible mistake." Linda's tear-streaked face turned toward him, silently pleading, while Alex and Timothy avoided his eyes, their panic unmistakable. Carl crossed his arms, his crew standing silently behind him, waiting for his next command. "This is what happens when you mess with my family," Carl said, his tone final. "You don't walk away. You don't get a second chance. You face the consequences." The glade fell silent, an oppressive stillness blanketing the area as Carl's words hung in the air like a dark omen. The three captives quivered where they knelt, their fear palpable and raw. Carl paced methodically, his boots grinding against the loose gravel. The moonlight glanced off the machete in his hand, casting a cold, merciless gleam that mirrored his resolve. Linda, Alex, and Timothy whimpered softly, their muffled cries barely discernible in the suffocating quiet. Stopping a short distance from the trio, Carl raised his hand, signaling one of his men. Without a word, the subordinate stepped forward, placing the weapon into Carl's waiting grasp before retreating into the shadows. Carl turned the machete slowly, inspecting the blade as though weighing his next course of action. His voice, low and steady, sliced through the silence. "You know," he began, his tone calm yet laced with menace, "I gave up that life. The crime, the violence, all for my brother and his kids. They were my anchor, the reason I tried to be better." He paused, his piercing gaze flicking between the captives, ensuring every word struck its intended target. "But then there's people like you," he continued, his voice hardening with each word. "You push, you destroy lives, and now, here I am, dragged back to the darkness I fought so hard to escape." Carl moved closer to Linda, his imposing frame casting a long shadow over her trembling form. "You've stirred something in me," he murmured, his voice dropping to an almost intimate whisper. "Something I thought I'd buried for good. You brought the devil out of his grave." A tense, loaded silence engulfed the clearing. At Carl's signal, two of his men yanked Linda to her feet. She swayed unsteadily, her knees buckling beneath her as they forced her upright. "Turn her around," Carl commanded. One of his men roughly spun her to face Alex and Timothy, who remained bound and kneeling. Carl loomed behind her, resting the blade casually on his shoulder. "Let me ask you the same question my brother once asked," he said, leaning in close to Linda's ear. "What happens when John finds you like this, with two men?" Linda gasped sharply, frozen in terror. Her eyes darted helplessly to Alex and Timothy, their own expressions wide with horror. The tension was stifling, broken only by the faint rustling of the wind through the surrounding trees. Carl remained still, his face a mask of cold indifference, the blade in his hand catching faint glints of moonlight. "You were so bold before, Linda," Carl said with quiet disdain, his voice dropping to a mocking tone. "Wasn't it you who said, 'You chop balls'? Well then." Her strangled sob was the only response she could muster. Carl gestured sharply, and his men seized Alex and Timothy, dragging them to the ground despite their desperate attempts to resist. Their muffled cries grew louder, but Carl's demeanor remained icily detached. "Hold them," Carl ordered. His men tightened their grip, pinning the two down as they thrashed against their restraints. Alex's eyes bulged in terror, and Timothy's struggles grew frantic. Carl approached Timothy first, his movements deliberate and calculated, like a hunter circling its prey. Crouching to meet his captive's gaze, Carl spoke softly, his words carrying a chilling finality. "You thought you could destroy my brother's life, take his family, and walk away unscathed?" he said, his tone calm, almost conversational. "Actions have consequences. Now you'll face yours." With a firm resolve, Carl swung the machete downward. A loud crash echoed through the clearing as it struck the ground near Alex, a sharp sound that sent shivers through everyone present. Dark stains spread across the ground as Carl shifted his focus to Timothy. Linda's sobs grew louder, her body racked with uncontrollable shudders as she witnessed the grisly scene. "Please!" she cried through her gag, her voice fractured and desperate. "Stop! Please!" Carl didn't so much as glance at her. His cold focus shifted to Alex. "And you," he said, his voice razor-sharp, "thought your wealth and power made you untouchable, that you could destroy lives without consequence." He leaned in closer, his tone dropping to a whisper. "Think again." Carl swung the machete once more, its motion deliberate and unyielding. Timothy gasped sharply, his panic evident as Carl's steely gaze held steady. A silent warning to all who opposed him. His voice, sharp and commanding, broke through the aftermath. "Take them," he instructed his men, motioning toward the two maimed captives. "Dump them at the nearest hospital, alive." Turning to Linda, now collapsed in a heap of despair, Carl's eyes burned with cold fury. "You," he hissed, "aren't walking away either, but first you'll learn what happens when you cross the wrong man." Carl's silhouette loomed over her trembling form, the machete dripping onto the parched earth below. His expression was unreadable, his voice eerily calm as he tilted his head, speaking with a sinister edge. "Linda," he said, his tone mockingly regretful, "it seems I underestimated what needed to be done. But don't worry, I'll correct that mistake." Linda's expression twisted in a mixture of terror and bewilderment, her trembling lips parting as though to speak, but no sound came. Carl loomed closer, his towering frame radiating menace, until his face was just inches from hers. In a voice so cold it seemed to freeze the air, he whispered, "I should have started with you." The weight of his words struck Linda like a hammer blow. A guttural scream tore from her throat, cutting through the still night as Carl moved with deadly precision. The machete swung through the air, its motion swift and deliberate, leaving an indelible mark on the tense atmosphere of the clearing. Linda crumpled to the ground, clutching her chest as agony racked her body. Her cries were primal, raw, and unrelenting, echoing into the emptiness around her. Carl stood over her, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, his face carved from stone. He watched impassively as Linda convulsed, tears streaking her face, her screams devolving into hoarse, ragged sobs. "Now you understand," Carl said, his voice devoid of warmth. "That's the kind of pain you've inflicted on others, through your lies, your betrayals, your greed. You've made suffering your currency, and now you're paying the price." For a moment, the clearing was silent except for Linda's shuddering gasps. Carl wiped the machete clean on the hem of his jacket with methodical precision. His gaze swept to his men, who stood at the edges of the scene, their faces grim and resolute. "Do you know why we call this place the Spot?" Carl asked, his voice cutting through the silence like the edge of his blade. Linda lifted her head weakly, her face contorted in pain, unable to respond. Her faint, gasping breaths were the only acknowledgement she could muster. Carl's lips curled into a dark smile, his eyes scanning the tree line. "It's where we leave the scraps for the scavengers." As if summoned, faint shapes began to appear at the perimeter of the clearing. Jackals and coyotes emerged cautiously from the shadows, their glowing eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. They sniffed the blood-soaked air, their low growls and yips building into a chorus of hunger. Carl jerked his head toward the vehicles parked in the distance. "We're done here," he said coldly. "Let nature take care of the rest." Without hesitation, the group began to retreat, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel as the scavengers crept closer. Linda's muffled cries mingled with the growls of the advancing beasts, the horrifying sounds fading into the night as Carl and his men disappeared into the darkness. The sterile hospital room was quiet, except for the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the bed where John lay, his face pale but composed. A uniformed officer stood nearby, his tone professional yet detached as he spoke. "We recovered remains near the border," the officer reported. "It appears they were attacked by animals, your wife and two unidentified men. It was a gruesome scene." He paused briefly, studying John's reaction. Unless new evidence surfaces, the case will be closed. John nodded slowly, murmuring his thanks. As the officer left, his gaze shifted to Carl, who sat by the window, his posture casual but his eyes fixed on the hospital parking lot below. "Carl," John said softly, his voice steady despite its weakness. "Was it you?" For a long moment, Carl didn't respond, his focus remaining on the view outside. Then, with a slight shrug, he turned to face his brother, his expression unreadable. "I wouldn't know anything about that," Carl replied evenly, a faint twitch at the corners of his lips betraying the ghost of a smirk. John exhaled a dry, humorless laugh, a fleeting glimmer of understanding passing between the brothers. Carl allowed himself a small, knowing smile before standing and adjusting his jacket. "You know," Carl said, his tone laced with wry humor, "I might have just saved you a fortune in court fees." John shook his head weakly, a faint chuckle escaping his lips. "You're one hell of a guy, Carl." Carl turned toward the door but paused before leaving. "I've got to head out for a while, John," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "There's no running from what I am. Sooner or later, the shadows pull me back." "Carl," John began, but his brother raised a hand, cutting him off. "Take care of the boys," Carl said. "That's all that matters." With that, Carl stepped out, leaving his brother in the dim hospital room. Outside, a group of men waited in silence. Their presence was formidable, their expressions betraying nothing but loyalty. One of them stepped forward, holding a sleek black jacket embroidered with a vivid red dragon. Carl took it, a faint smile playing on his lips as he slid it over his shoulders. The weight was familiar, the fabric carrying an air of power and authority. His men watched him with quiet respect as Carl adjusted his cuffs, exuding an unshakable confidence. His gaze swept over the crew, his sharp eyes betraying a steely resolve. "Let's get moving," Carl said simply. With that, the group departed as one, their footsteps fading into the night. Behind them, the faint glow of the hospital lights dimmed into obscurity, and Carl Griffin, once a man trying to leave the darkness behind, embraced it once more. Months after the chaos, John Griffin began piecing his life back together. His sons were his anchor, their laughter and innocence giving him purpose. The divorce was finalized, and the restraining orders ensured his home was a safe haven again. John embraced his role as a father, pouring his energy into rebuilding their world, but whispers of Carl Griffin's actions lingered, casting a long shadow over the family. Carl disappeared into the underworld, his name spoken in hushed tones. Stories of his return to power spread, painting him as a ghost of vengeance, a man who could not escape his nature. For John, the memory of Carl's unwavering loyalty was bittersweet. He owed his brother his life, but at what cost? As he watched his boys play in the yard, John felt the weight of gratitude and sorrow. His brother had walked into the darkness to ensure their light remained. Far away, in a distant city, Carl sat in a dimly lit room, surrounded by his crew. A new chapter of his story was unfolding, one written in shadows and fire. The dragon on his back burned bright, a symbol of the man he had become, and the sacrifices he had made to protect his family. For John, the future was a path of hope. For Carl, it was a road of reckoning. But for both brothers, the bond of family was unbreakable, no matter how far their paths diverged.